Welcome to our edWeb presentation on child sex trafficking prevention, a course for educators. Welcome, Tony. A children's nurturer at a domestic violence agency. That's big work. Thank you for coming. This webinar is brought to you by Digital Respons-Ability, which is the company that I work for, and Carrie is the CEO and founder of. As you can see here, we believe in a prevention science approach to preventing online behavior before it happens. And we like to work with students, parents, and educators to ensure that that we are all trained. Okay, and today's presentation, we'll be hearing a lot from Nate Davis, who works for Prevent Child Abuse Utah. They have an ed team, and they also have a team that goes out to work with parents at home. And then their ed team goes out to schools and gives presentations to students to help them be aware of how they can help themselves in child abuse situations. They are the largest nonprofit helping, how would you say this, Nate?
Sure. The largest nonprofit solely dedicated to preventing child abuse in the state of Utah.
So. Perfect. And they've been around since '92, and they do excellent work. 82. I'm sorry. I wrote down 92.
You're all good.
82. And we are so happy to partner with them here in Utah. We do a lot of trainings together. Okay, so I'm going to turn this webinar right over to Nate, hear from him and from Carrie later. And enjoy, guys. Submit your questions as talked about before. I look forward to seeing them.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Tay. Wonderful. Well, hello, and welcome to our child sex trafficking prevention course for educators. My name is Nathan Davis. I'm an education specialist for Prevent Child Abuse Utah. I'll be presenting today with Carrie Rogers-Whitehead from DR, as we just discussed. We love working with DR. Should be an awesome presentation today. So perfect. So this topic has actually garnered a lot of interest, a lot of recent attention, and we're happy about that. Really eager to present to you today, and we thank you for your willingness to do your part for the community and for your schools. So this is a breakdown of the outline for today. So if you ever want to know where we are at in a presentation, you can just follow that moving agenda. It's those small circles in the bottom corner of the screen, if you're curious where we're at in the presentation. So it looks like we're going to take a moment for a poll question right off the bat to see what you guys know already about this topic. So we'll give you a few minutes to work on that. School counselors, very nice.
I'll just pop in to discuss this poll result. We've got all sorts of representation.
We do.
A lot of early childhood and youth trafficking and teachers and librarians.
All right. So the first thing to cover is the definition of child sex trafficking, right? So today, we will be focusing on sex trafficking of children as opposed to labor trafficking. So it's helpful to think of sexual abuse as an umbrella term, with child sex trafficking as a subcategory of child sexual abuse. So human sex trafficking is defined as, quote, the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into a commercial sex act. With that said, in the case of child sex trafficking, no force, fraud, or coercion is required. Of course, because since any sex act with a kid or a child is considered coercive and criminal by default, right? So children cannot consent to any sexual activity under any circumstance. Very good. So certain populations are actually at an increased risk of being targeted for child sex trafficking. So just a few populations. So kids that have an unstable living situation are at a higher risk, have a history of domestic violence in the home, have a caregiver or family member who has a substance abuse problem, are runaways or involved in the juvenile justice system or foster care system, or finally, this is an important one, have a history of physical and or sexual abuse or neglect. Okay, so all of those various factors increase the likelihood that a kid will be targeted by a trafficker, right? And we'll go why into more detail in just a little bit. So just real quickly, I think it's important to kind of discuss in what ways child sex trafficking differs from just child sexual abuse in general, right? So child sexual abuse in general is very, very often opportunistic, right? So a perpetrator may target a child for particular reasons, or maybe a child with low self-esteem or a teen with low self-esteem, could be a child that lacks a support system or lacks age-appropriate information about sexuality or human anatomy. In the case of child sexual abuse, the relationship is usually kept very, very secret, okay, between the perpetrator and the victim. Whereas in the case of child sex trafficking situations, multiple adults have knowledge of the abuse and are facilitating it for financial or other personal gain. So it's precisely because multiple adult traffickers are usually close to their victims that such victims are especially unlikely to recognize the trafficking as harmful or abnormal. So, very good. So, just to give you guys some context, a couple examples of what child sex trafficking might look like. I have a couple examples here. So, number one, a 16-year-old girl in foster care meets a stylish woman in her late 20s who claims to be a, quote, modeling agent. The woman likes and comments on several of her social media posts, showering her with compliments. After several months of grooming, the teen is convinced to run away from her foster home in order to interview for a position at the agency. The teen is sexually trafficked and abused under the false pretense that fame and success are just around the corner. The traffickers also discourage the teen from returning home or obtaining help through threats of harm. So that's our first case, I want you guys to consider. In our second case here, an 8-year-old boy is told by his mother that he needs to perform sexual acts for their landlord, or they'll be evicted and forced to live on the streets. The young boy, out of guilt and fear for his family, performs the sex acts for the landlord. The boy believes he willingly participated in the sexual abuse and that he and his family will be criminally charged if he tries to obtain help. Okay, so again, certain populations are especially at risk, right? So what these perpetrators are doing is they're trying to find a need that they can fill for that child, right? And we'll go more into detail about that in just a little bit. But again, I think it's important to keep in mind that kids that, you know, from the various populations we discussed are at greater risk. Very good. All right. So take a look at these pictures for a second, okay? So there are a lot of myths out there about what child sex trafficking looks like and what it entails, right? And unfortunately, those myths actually get in the way of helping victims get the help that they need, right? It diverts resources from worthwhile causes. So I think it's important to maybe just dispel a few of these myths right off the bat. So look at these images real quickly. So let's see here. All right. So our first myth we're going to talk about today. So number one, victims of child sex trafficking are usually abducted, right? So in most cases of child sex trafficking, it's not a violent crime. So you may have seen Taken, Hollywood depictions of sex trafficking, right? So typically, it's not a violent crime, right? Usually, victims are groomed into sex trafficking and then forced into secrecy through the use of addiction, of violence, or the threat of violence against the child or their families, okay? Number two, second myth. Perpetrators of child sex trafficking are usually strangers to the victim. So we teach kids all the time about stranger danger, right? And that's important for kids to understand. But the truth is, as in the case of abuse and child sex trafficking, most of the time the child knows their abuser, right? So over half of the time, over half of child sex traffickers were related to the victim. Okay, so that could mean it's very possibly mom, dad, uncle, grandpa, and so forth who are facilitating the trafficking. Very good. Myth number three. Victims are normally physically restrained or locked up. So victims of child sex trafficking stay in these situations for more complicated reasons than being physically restrained or tied up, right? As we discussed, often they lack basic human necessities or are being manipulated or coerced by others, right? Maybe they lack appropriate knowledge about the criminal justice system or about sexuality and so forth. Next myth. Child sex trafficking usually involves the transportation of goods across borders. So moving things across borders is actually called smuggling. It's a different crime, okay? And trafficking doesn't actually require any movement at all, right? So it could be and is happening in your own home, city, communities, or not home, your own communities and so forth, okay? So the key here is don't think it happens in foreign countries, right? This is happening in our own backyard. And thinking that it's happening only in foreign countries diverts resources from victims who need the help. All right. And the last myth here, I think this is a super important one. The only way to reduce child sex trafficking is to arrest all the perpetrators, right? So law enforcement is an important part of this, right? But arrests alone aren't going to solve this problem. The truth is that building and supporting strong families and communities will help prevent child sex trafficking before it even happens in the first place, right? So you want to make arrests, you want to get people make the streets a safer place for kids. But we also want to eliminate the systemic issues that are giving rise to trafficking in the first place, right? Poverty and so forth. So it's a holistic problem. All right. So I think we're gonna do another poll real quickly, if that's okay.
Okay, so second poll, has your organization ever offered training for staff on sex trafficking? I'm seeing a lot of no's.
I'm glad you're here then.
Okay, we'll give this 5 more seconds. Go ahead and get your vote in. It's required in New York. That's good to know, George. Thank you. I have a feeling most states it's not required.
We're very pleased by the interest in this, though. Lots of interest everywhere. So
we got about 70% saying no and 30% unsure or yes.
Okay, moving on. So the following patterns of behavior could indicate that a child, teen, or young adult is being sexually trafficked. Okay, so as discussed previously, trafficking is rarely as dramatic as Hollywood depicts it, right? Traffickers groom their victims, often from vulnerable populations, by filling particular needs, then isolate and threaten them in order to maintain control. As I mentioned before, myths about human trafficking stand in the way of helping victims get the help that they need. Okay. Youth and young adults experiencing homelessness often remain invisible as they live on the streets, in shelters, in their car, or staying temporarily with others. Okay, so homeless young people have already been failed by numerous systems in our society, right? We're supposed to be there to keep them safe, right? Older teens, young adults, as they first enter into their adult years, wanted to have a sturdy foundation. So these individuals are in survival mode, right? They're lacking basic necessities of life, a safe place to live, regular sources of food, and so forth. And that's really when the traffickers swoop in to fill that need. Okay, very good. So also, just real quickly, it's important to note that just because a child displays one of the following signs, right, that by itself does not mean the child is being trafficked. With that said, if we're seeing multiple signs, it could be worth making a report, okay? And we'll discuss this more in further detail in just a little bit. But it's always better to make a report and be wrong than to not make the report, right? So always report any suspicions that you may have. All right. So these are some terms that you might just keep your ears open for, right? Maybe in the classroom or in the library, where you're at. These could be potential red flags, right? So these are various terms that are often adopted by victims within the child trafficking subculture, okay? Keeping our eyes and ears open and alert can help us intervene when necessary, okay? So the first term we're going to discuss today, daddy, mama, or manager, okay? So these are terms that a trafficker may require their victims to call them. So for example, quote, daddy looks after his girls, right? So in this case, it would be the manager looking after the girls that are being trafficked, okay? Second term, the game / the life. This is the subculture of sex trafficking rules, power dynamics, and so forth. So for example, he or she doesn't understand the game yet, right? So maybe someone who's new to the scene, new to the subculture, that could be the slang that's used. Track/blade, an area of town known for prostitution activity, such as a strip club, massage parlor, etc. Quota, a set amount of money that victims must bring home each night before they can return, okay? And then finally, we have branding. So branding is a tattoo or carving on a victim that indicates ownership by a trafficker. And also note too, victims may not talk about the brand or the mark, right? But you may notice it yourself, a very, distinct, particular tattoo or mark on the body. All right. So this is an important slide. So children are often groomed by child sex traffickers through a process that begins with healthy/benign behaviors, which become increasingly harmful over time. So to help provide some context, consider the following case of child sex trafficking that took place in West Valley, Utah. So close to our office, actually, kind of close to home, this case. So in 2014, Victor Manuel Rax was charged with 34 felonies involving human trafficking, distributing a counterfeit substance, child endangerment, and unlawful sexual activity with a minor. Rax was charged with trafficking teen boys, mainly undocumented Latinos, for sexual purposes, and then using fear to force them into sex and drug trafficking. According to the amended probable cause statement filed in the 3rd District Court, Rax would, quote, use proceeds from his criminal enterprise in the form of money, gifts, controlled substances, and food as a way to groom the children to remain and or return to Rax, and eventually as a mechanism to overcome the will of the children in order to commit sexual offenses upon them. So Rax actually, this particular individual, Rax, actually committed suicide in custody, never actually convicted. In this particular case, Rax targeted especially vulnerable children. We discussed that, right? So in this case, undocumented children and adolescents. We can clearly see in this particular case how healthy or benign behaviors, for example, offering food or money or support to vulnerable teens and their families in a new country, right, quickly evolved into boundary violations, offering alcohol and drugs, grooming behaviors, for example, isolating the victims from their families, right, and then eventually sexual abuse. Rax also threatened his victims in various ways in order to prevent them from reporting, and that's common both in sexual abuse and in child sex trafficking. So this case really illustrates how the grooming cycle begins with behaviors that might be considered generous or even helpful to the child or the family, right? But over time, he's become increasingly aggressive and harmful. Often, in cases of child sex trafficking and child sex abuse in general, perpetrators may try to shame or guilt their victims by reminding them of their willingness to cross previous boundaries, such as using illicit substances. Perpetrators may go to great lengths to ensure that their victims experience some degree of arousal during the assault, which can be pleasurable, and then use this fact in order to convince the child victim that they, quote, participated or were complicit in the sexual assault in some way. The child is then isolated from family and loved ones and threatened in various ways in order to ensure the child's silence. Okay. So again, kids have lots of reasons to want to keep this a secret, right? There's a very good chance they're traffickers or someone they know and care about, that it's not a stranger, right? So if we see something happening, we want to report. And I'll go more into detail about that in just a little bit. We have a whole slide about how to report, who to contact, the right avenues to go through. But before we get there, I'm going to turn over to Carrie for just a few minutes, who's going to talk to us about how child sex trafficking and technology are interrelated. So.
No, thank you, Nate. And I really like what you were saying around myths and realities. I'm going to be talking about misinformation that is perpetuating some of those myths and other things out there too. So I appreciate that. We're going to go on to this next section, as Nate was talking about, is how is online safety and child sex trafficking connected? How can we work together? Where are things happening? What happens a little bit? And how can we focus on online safety also help the great work that people like Prevent Child Abuse Utah do to help prevent child sex trafficking? So I've gone into much more detail on this in other presentations. I don't have as much time because there's a whole big giant world of online sources. I'm covering some biggies here, but yes, it's grooming, and that's a great question that someone asked. So grooming is kind of what Nate was talking about a little bit here in like giving and praising. He gave that case study of the 16-year-old who was showered with praise on social media. So to make them kind of grooming, think like gardening, you're watering, you're taking care of it, you're praising, that could be gifts, all of that before that cycle goes down. And that's that kind of like, hey, I'm going to give you food, I'm going to give you money before it moves into trafficking. So we're going to talk about that grooming behavior, which often happens online here. So to get started, here are some stats. Now I have to note, and Nate could probably say this too, we need better research about this because a lot of it happens underground and we don't get everything reported, and we don't always have the story of the victims or the perpetrators out there. So these stats I have are a few years old, and we need better stats out there. So these are some though, but as Nate was saying earlier, is that it's family members that are most likely to be trafficking. They're meeting their victims in person. There's usually that personal touch. Although I have read stats that maybe it's a little bit over 50% can be online, but we need better stats because a lot of this happens underground where we're not seeing it exactly. But the risk factors remain the same, and typically it is people that the child knows, and they might be groomed online or communicated online, but it's the same thing with stranger danger. It doesn't necessarily happen that way online either. But what happens online is they're advertised. There's ads, they're posted, they're shared, they communicate. So they might not be, as Nate said, a myth was that they're chained up, that they're locked up. They're not chained up. They just have a cell phone. And the cell phone is used as those chains. It's used as like a way to track where they're at, what they're doing, GPS on, all of it out there. So you don't have to have chains to track someone everywhere you are. All you need is a smartphone. So we have had a big increase in online advertising. So street advertising versus like, shuffling along who you know in person. It's shifted to online. It makes the market bigger out there. You can reach more people to have this, especially if you're dealing with child pornography or images. There doesn't have to be a meeting in person, and that's pornography and child pornography is part of sex trafficking as well. And I was reading this stat with We Are Thorn too, is that some of these teens, these are reports from victims, they were writing the ads and communicated with the buyers themselves. So as they go through that cycle that Nate was talking about, like they want, you owe me, right? You owe me. I did this for you. I'm helping you. I'm your daddy. I'm your manager. Well, I'm the manager. You go write the ad. You go talk to the John. You go whatever. It's your job. So they might not even be aware of it as well. And as Ava mentioned, they're inexperienced, and they don't have as much of this experience and what a healthy relationship looks like, what all of this looks like there too. So here are some stats. We need better stats because there is a lot of myth and misinformation, and a lot of this happens underground in places that we can't always see. And one of the reasons that it's hard to see is because of end-to-end encryption. So end-to-end encryption basically makes it harder for someone to come in between the messages. So if you're sending a message through Signal or Telegram or a couple end-to-end encrypted apps, you can't intercept it as much. But what that also means is companies that run end-to-end encryption have a harder time sharing text to law enforcement. So some pros of this is online privacy. Some cons of this is law enforcement's job is harder. So we want online privacy, right? We teach this at school. We tell kids not to share certain things on all of this as well, but it also can contribute to some of these issues that law enforcement might have. They might not have a record of it. They might not know what's going on. You might not have evidence if someone wants to go to court or another issue there. So the end-to-end encryption makes law enforcement's jobs harder. And the traffickers will know the different apps. They will know what's out there, and they're probably going to use certain apps that might be harder for tracking and everything out there too. What we recommend in terms of prevention is that it's hard, especially if a child, they say something that they're embarrassed at, they share something they shouldn't have that's maybe inappropriate. Their immediate impulse is to delete, to get rid of. We want to put that away. We don't want to remember that. We feel shame around that. We feel upset around that behavior. Nate talks about that shame. And so what happens is sometimes the evidence that is out there online disappears, and we don't always have it. So privacy. This is another tech trend that is making law enforcement's job harder there. So I mentioned some of those encrypted messaging apps. Signal, Telegram, and Kik in particular. Kik is, you just need an email to sign up. They don't have much verification at all. There's video chats on that one. It's very easy to do photos and video chats. And that can be definitely a place for some of that trafficking to happen there too. So when I go and teach parents, I talk about what I call red flag apps, and these are two on my red flag list. I think they're very convenient. I like the privacy factor that, things disappear, and I'm very private online, but they're also used for, not so great purposes as well. Some nefarious and somewhat and even illegal purposes as well with these encrypted messaging apps. And it does make law enforcement's job harder. But I'm glad that so we can't always see what's going on with the tricky people, as Dennis mentions, but it can be a red flag if a child is using certain apps and using certain messages, texting late at night, not showing the phone, hiding things. All of that can be a red flag. There can be some tech red flags too to watch out for that educators can look into, and those are a couple of my red flag apps. These are some definite red flags. What I call these online sexual silos, and I just call them silos because they're just kind of separate away from the rest of things out there. So, and I can't remember the exact year, was it 2007, 2018, there was Backpage, where a lot of the online advertisements were out there. It was shut down by law enforcement. And then since then, all the Craigslist was a big one too. And Craigslist got rid of all their advertisements and things on there, and Backpage. But when it went down, it's like the cockroaches went to the other dark places. They spread out everywhere. And this is another reason why it can be hard for law enforcement. Look, Backpage had a lot of illegal activity going on there with advertisements, trafficking, all of that out there. But it was kind of in one place. And Craigslist was kind of in one place. And now it's very dispersed out things. And that can make it harder to what's going on. So last time I looked, I try to keep on trend and all of these things and investigate it as part of my job. It was up, it was shut down, it's back. But that's often what happens. Even Kik was shut down a year and a half ago, shut down, comes back, gets banned, comes back. So they're just like weeds a lot of the time, and they just keep moving. The cockroaches are weeds, they sprout up, they skitter around over here, they sprout up again, they come again. It can be hard to find out where this is happening, and it's difficult. So similar to Backpage, I have a few things out there. Some of them, there's extra verification that you have to join. This is a thing with Kik. If you want to join a group, and there are groups out there where child pornographic images are shared, you have to verify through a video, or you have to write something, show something, so they can be verified for certain of these. They're almost like membership subscription kind of places here. And Red Maps is one that's particular for massage parlors in general, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in another slide as it relates to sex trafficking. So red maps are like GPS. You can actually see which one is near your home. People write reviews, but they're not reviews like Yelp. They're reviews about sexual experiences. They write about the cost, who was there, everything that happens on those particular red maps massage parlors. And I'm glad that, Jessica, you mentioned, I think you mean Omegle. That one's an old app, and it's come back this last year, and it's kind of random video chat apps out there, and it came from nowhere. It kind of faded away, and now it's back. been around since like 2009 or something, but it's a way that, there doesn't always have to be a person-to-person instance when there is child sex trafficking. There can be explicit videos, texts, sexting, all sorts of things out there. And Twitter is alternative to Twitter. There's sugar daddy sites out there as well. So they're not always, the verification process on these things is not always very good, or almost non-existent, for lack of a better word. So a child sex trafficker might not ever put the child up physically to have sex with other people. They might send pictures, have videos, set them up with chats, all of this kind of stuff on some of these sexual silos out there that now they're kind of dispersed across multiple places. But to be clear, I'm going to circle back to that. There's a lot of mainstream sites used for this too. So it's not like it's all happening in all those other places. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of them are popular sites for grooming. And this exchange happens there too. Because, it's not like it's inherently created for that. Just everyone uses it. And if you're a trafficker and trying to reach people, well, you're going to go where they're at, right? And this is something that we need to tell our young people, is that you meet someone on Facebook, a big red flag is if they want you to take it to another platform. Well, let's talk on Kick now. I met you here, and they want to maybe move it off. They met a dating profile. They want to move it off there to sometimes those different sites, and they're very well used. I will say the moderating is better. There's more ways to report things on mainstream sites versus those others. Not like you can call like Backpage and be like, hey Backpage, I don't like my ad. There's not like a customer service and a moderating team on any of those things. There is more on some of these mainstream sites, but just the propensity of how many teens use them, how often they're used, how familiar they're used, that can be a site for grooming. And so Nate mentioned some terms used earlier in child sex trafficking, and these are some terms that might be used in an advertisement. So they're not going to put an advertisement out there and be like, hey, sex with a 13-year-old. They're going to be like, hey, it's a teen, sex with this teen, right? And a teen could be 18, right? They're not going to say that, right? They're going to say, oh, this young, or it's a virgin. They're going to use those words instead of just explicitly saying it, because that's easier for the sites to take it down. So they use different words to kind of hide things. There's different hashtags out there. So they can use this hashtag to kind of signal something, all of it out there. And some of it might be in plain sight, but you're not always aware, which kind of leads me to this story. So Nate shared a story in Utah. Here's another story in Utah. I bring up this story because that picture right there is next to my accountant's office. And he was there. I visited my accountant the day after that raid happened, and we had a long conversation about this. So in these massage parlors, they were all human trafficking victims. These were adults, not children, but all four of them, they were all connected, and they were human trafficking victims. And I remember talking to my accountant the day after this happened, and he was just shocked. He's like, I had no idea, because they lived there. They'd come by with packages. They brought us food, and we'd talk. We'd have to use the Translate app, but we would talk, right? So he just felt bad. He felt horrible that he didn't know. But like Nate was saying, is that this is willingly. They're not in chains. They're not putting up signs or like sending secret messages to help them. They're out in the open. And so they, he was saying that there was some weird stuff going on that he reported to the landlord, but he didn't think it was human trafficking at all. But in some of those massage parlors, not all of them, just to be clear, human trafficking can occur, and it might just be happening right under your nose. And he lived next to them for 6 months. Their officers right there, and they had no idea, knew the women, all of it there. So just to be fair, and it's hard. This is hard stuff. And they don't look like those traditional victims. They don't look like the media might portray. It's not the same way that you might think. And some of that is because, I'm going to skip over and come back to this misinformation. A lot of the reasons we think that some of this, we get confused about what trafficking is because there is a lot of misinformation. And so Nate mentioned some of those myths. He talked about how there's not abduction is a myth, right? If you know someone, it's not necessarily a violent crime. It's the perpetrator. They're not locked up by any means there. So there's a lot of misinformation. And I need to bring up, this is one reason sex trafficking has been brought up so much, is because QAnon has brought up a lot of misinformation about child trafficking. So to take you back a bit, this started happening in October 2017 with 4chan, as Q started making drops of information about a secret cabal in the government. And part of that conspiracy is that this secret cabal were pedophiles engaging in child sex trafficking. And it's a very complicated conspiracy theory with many different threads. I'm just going to talk about the link to child sex trafficking there. What was interesting about that child sex trafficking conspiracy theory is that it reached new audiences on mainstream sites. Instagram was a huge place for QAnon sex trafficking conspiracy theories with the hashtag Save Our Children. And those myths were being perpetuated, that children were just being abducted off the street, and that, your kid can go to the playground and then they're gone all of a sudden, right? And then there was a conspiracy theory about the Wayfair furniture company, that they were transporting these children in these furniture. All myths. But this misinformation about child sex trafficking affects people working in this area. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline reported a surge of false reports or people just that were upset and called in. And I get why people are upset. They're like, oh my gosh, this is happening. I can't believe it. What do I do? There was a lot of well-meaning people that were engaged in this that just didn't know. But it really kind of hurt people doing this work, because the work in prevention and we got some prevention people in this group, the work is not pretty or glamorous. You're not knocking down doors. You're going in slowly to talk to people, to talk to parents, to go into homes. You're working on a systemic level because a lot of the systems perpetuate this child sex trafficking. So when we talk about online safety, media literacy is part of that too, right? Knowing where the sources come from, what they mean, critically thinking about all of those sources. And unfortunately, this became a rallying cry behind a lot of misinformation for well-meaning people that wanted to prevent child sex trafficking may have inadvertently hurt it by taking away resources and time from people from working in this area. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. Some of that was perpetuated by, media reports of Jeffrey Epstein. And so that got twisted into it as well. But Nate and I are trying to share some of the truth. The truth is not made for TV. It's ugly. It's not pretty. It's intergenerational poverty. It's all of these systemic issues that can create it there too. And now I've been talking about some scary stuff with the technology here and all of that. But I do want to talk about the positives as well, because we can't just, what can help? And technology can help. Nate mentioned this earlier. Access to sex ed can be a protective factor for sex trafficking. And maybe children aren't getting this in schools, but they can access some great resources. Also some not great resources, but there are some good resources out there on sex ed online. There are helplines out there, survivors groups. So if there's a victim that can find people that have been through what they've been through and connect on social media, they can heal together, they can talk together. There's some great telehealth resources that I love. One thing that's been great with COVID-19 is a growth of telehealth, so people can talk to others online to get that therapy and help, and a way to reach people outside the lifestyle. So a phone can be, shackles and manacles for a trafficker to keep tabs on someone, but it also can be that lifeline as well, a way for them to reach out, for them to get out, and for them to have that ongoing help that they're going to need when they come out as well. So technology definitely can help. And I mentioned this earlier, but I want to kind of drive it in. If we are trying to prevent sex trafficking, most children are advertised online. A lot of grooming behaviors happens online. We have to incorporate a lot of this online safety piece in our sex trafficking prevention, because that's a piece of it as well. We can educate kids better about being media literate, what tools they're using, what are healthy behaviors online, what are unhealthy behaviors, all of that out there, and it can be part of that child sex trafficking prevention. So I'm going to turn it over to Nate to kind of share some more information before we take the questions and answers. And I love the comments here, and we're going to get to some of them at the end. So I'll mute my mic here.
Awesome. Thank you, Carrie. Awesome information. So just real quickly, we're going to go over the ABCDs of receiving a disclosure from a kid. Okay. So I'm just going to say right off the bat, disclosures of trafficking from children are rare. Okay. Because the child is often groomed into thinking that what's happening is normal, and there are usually multiple adults, often within the child's family, facilitating the trafficking, right? Children may also fear retaliation if they tell someone. They may fear losing the relationship with the trafficker, mistaking manipulation for love, and may depend upon the trafficker for economic support. That's a big one. Okay. As is common with abuse, they may feel guilty. I saw some awesome comments in the chat about this, right? So almost always when kids are abused, they really do feel like it's their fault, like they did something to deserve it. Okay. So whenever we receive a disclosure of abuse, the first thing we want to do is just remind that child over and over again, it's never the child's fault if they're being abused, right? Because almost certainly the child thinks that it is. Very good. Also, too, on this note, children may not understand the legal or criminal justice system, right? And may think that if they tell, they're going to get in trouble, right? They may have been told that they've broken the law by engaging in these activities and so forth. So lots of reasons why a kid might keep this a secret. With that said, if you do receive a disclosure, even if it is rare, it's really important to understand how to respond appropriately. And understanding how to report child abuse generally is just an important thing for our communities to understand. So we'll go over these real quickly. The A stands for assure. So assure the child they did the right thing by coming to talk to you. So now is a good time to rehab these conversations with kids. Let them know they are brave and smart for talking to you. Again, let them know it is not their fault and they are not to blame. And then assure them that you will do everything you can within your power to help them. Okay. So don't make promises you can't keep, right? Research suggests that making promises we can't keep actually hurts bonds of trust with kids and decreases the chance they'll report to us in the future, and be honest. Okay. So we can't say things like, I promise it's all going to be okay, right? Or I promise not to tell anybody. I can't say that, but I can say things like, I promise to do my best to get you some help, right? I'm going to do everything that I can to help you. I can make that promise. B stands for believe the child. So very few reports of sexual abuse are falsely reported by kids. Okay, if a kid makes a report, we need to believe them. Also, sexually abused children who are not believed are at a greater risk for psychological, emotional, social, and physical problems, often lasting into adulthood. So it could be chronic. The B also stands for be calm. Okay, so expressing shock or panic can frighten a child and make the child shut down or believe they were the cause of your shock and panic, right? Keep in mind that children who are sexually abused can and do heal, right? And then, of course, try not to show anger towards the offender, who may be someone the child loves, right? We discussed that earlier. Most of the time that a child's being abused, it's not by a stranger, it's by someone the child knows and trusts. And showing anger towards the perpetrator can actually burden the child, especially if that perpetrator is someone the child cares and loves for, or loves and cares for. All right. So the C stands for child talks. So ask open-ended questions. So for example, tell me more about that. What do you mean by that? What happened next? And so forth. Okay. So kids are suggestible, right? We want to plant ideas in their head. We want to get the truth. So ask open-ended questions. Very good. Also, too, if we ask very specific questions that aren't open-ended, it can make the disclosure seem coached, right? And that can actually hurt the case if it goes to trial, or if there's criminal proceedings. So again, open-ended questions. And then finally, D, determine the child's needs, okay? So if you receive the report from a child, it needs to be you who calls that in, okay? I'd encourage you to have a supervisor on the, there with you or on the phone with you for support, but they don't want hearsay. They want to hear it from you, okay? Also, too, if the child's in immediate danger, call 911, right? If not, call the appropriate hotline, and the next slide will go over that right now. So, on this next slide, we have a number of different hotlines to call, okay? So, every adult in the state of Utah is a mandated reporter. I'm not sure about other states. That's actually a good question. But I know that in Utah, every adult is required to report any suspected child abuse, okay? If it's discovered later on that they had knowledge of the abuse and did not report, they can be charged with a crime, okay? So this law holds adults accountable. I think it's an important law. So if you have received a disclosure of abuse that does not involve child sex trafficking, call the child abuse hotline, that first one up there, okay? If you believe you've witnessed human trafficking or child sex trafficking in person, okay, don't approach the traffickers yourself, okay? This can place you or the victim in danger and jeopardize the possibility of future prosecution by the state. So if you see something in person, maybe just unsafe, suspicious situation, call the UTIP. It's Utah Trafficking In-Person Force. It's the tip line, and tell them your suspicions, okay? They can kind of walk you through that, maybe ask you to get some information, take some pictures, and so forth. All right. If you believed you've witnessed human trafficking online, or child sex trafficking online, child pornography online, okay, report your suspicions to the ICAC, Internet Crimes Against Children tip line. Let them know what you believe you saw or observed, and provide them with actionable information, okay? By that, I mean things like usernames, app names, maybe screenshot the profile, the comments, the discussion forum, whatever, okay? Actionable things. And then, of course, if you're not sure what number to call, okay, just call the child abuse reporting hotline. They can walk you through who to call, get you to the appropriate number, or they can call themselves. So when in doubt, call that first number. All right. So just real quickly, to tell you a little bit about what PCAU does. So PCAU's raison d'etre, or reason for being, okay, is the protection of Utah's children and families. Our education team works with school administrators and counselors across the state to ensure that as many students as possible learn how to recognize, resist, and report child abuse, while our Parents as Teachers program works with at-risk families directly in the home. So it's really because of generous contributions from the community that PCAU is able to continue this important work. So we thank you so much for being here today and taking time to learn about this important topic. And I believe that together we can provide hope to those without a voice and contribute to the flourishing of our communities. So thank you so much. And then I have some references here for you if you're dubious of my sources. So awesome. Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and turn it over then to Tay for some questions.
Okay, we have a number of questions today. When we got 2 questions about the hotline numbers you talked about, I believe 2 of those are just for Utah. Was that top one a national line?
That's a great point. That one was just for Utah, actually, unfortunately. I'm pretty sure you can just Google "report child abuse America" and or wherever state that you're in, and the first number that pops up is usually the accurate one.
Yeah, the National Child for Missing and Exploited Children has a cyber tip line as well that you can report.
Yeah, those other sources should be fine wherever you're located. It's just that first number that was the abuse reporting line. Great question.
Okay, let's see. One question is, are there any places where trafficking rate is higher, urban compared to rural?
I'm not sure. Nate, do you know that one?
I don't know. That is a great question. I'm gonna write that down. Actually, that's something to look into.
Yeah, that's something we should know here.
Yeah,
I mean, I know that I know the socioeconomic status is the big one here, right? And you can have poor rural or poor urban communities, right? But I'm not sure if there's a urban-rural divide there. Good question.
Okay, another question is, do we offer virtual PD for staff at back-to-school events?
Yes, both of we do at Digital Respons-Ability. I know you do as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, we also have presentations we're happy to give to professionals of every sort. So
we actually give certified certification in digital citizenship. It doesn't, I mean, there's some touches on online safety as well, but we work with Prevent Child Abuse Utah on some of these topics, and both, we want to help you out.
Okay. All right, and we've got a pre-K kindergarten teacher wondering if this is wholly relevant for 3, 4, and 5-year-old teachers of 3, 4, and 5-year-olds as well.
I would say yes. I would say the sooner they can start to learn some of these things, I mean, make sure it's age appropriate, of course. But I mean, kids that don't have knowledge, age appropriate knowledge of their bodies, of anatomy, as we discussed, they're likely to be targeted, right? So 3, 4, 5. I mean, I'm not going to be the judge here, but that's not too young to be having, to start having those conversations. So
yeah. One question: how can we support vulnerable families as preventative measures against child sex trafficking?
Do you want to take that one, Nate? You do a lot of work with families.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing we discuss for presenting to school counselors, for example, is it's called the protective factors, right? So as with preventing child abuse in general, eliminating child sex trafficking is a holistic effort, right? It means tackling things like socioeconomic issues, mental health problems, poverty, and so forth, right? So it's communities that are at risk or have a need that isn't being filled, right? Those are the populations the traffickers are honing in on and targeting. So really one of the best things we can do to help reduce child sex trafficking is just help to build stronger communities, right? And that can look, like many different things. So I think, tackling poverty and systemic issues is a big part of this.
Okay, one last one. And do we have the most current data on global child trafficking? Sorry.
My sets were focused on the U.S., so I can't speak for global areas as well. But as Nate said, a lot of this is happening in our own communities, and there's enough work to go around here, right? It's happening in our backyards, and with people that are next door sometimes.
It's true. So yeah, and I would say that this is happening in a diverse number of communities, because you don't have to necessarily look a certain way to be a victim of sex trafficking. It's more of your circumstances, and all populations are susceptible to having a hard go of it.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I think that about wraps it up. And we are so glad to have seen so many of you here. We are really excited to be working with you guys. Our next webinar is on Tuesday, May 18th, and this is one that we're putting on ourselves.
But we will be back. I should mention this, Tay. We will be back doing EdWeb in July with Dr. Patchen, of the co-director of the Cyberbullying Research Institute, and we will be talking about tweens and cyberbullying in July. So we don't have that slide up yet because it's a few more months. But if you're interested in cyberbullying, please follow us, and we'll be diving into the research around tweens and cyberbullying in July. But we'll be talking about this with BARC, with tech and tech-free solutions, in next month.
Yeah, it should be great. We're really excited to present that. Okay, I think that is everything. Thank you so much for coming.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
See you soon.
Yeah.